The old man's frail fingers trembled as he reached for his loyal German shepherd. His final wish was simply to see his only friend one last time. But when the dog entered the room, what happened next left everyone speechless. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the dimly lit hospital room, blending with the rhythmic beeping of machines that sustained the frail body of Harold Langston. The once powerful business magnate, who had commanded boardrooms with a mere glance, now lay powerless, his body a frail remnant of what it had once been. His face, carved with deep lines of regret and lost time, barely twitched as he exhaled a labored breath. The empire he had built, the fortune he had amassed, meant nothing in this moment. Outside the window, the city pulsed with life cars honked. People rushed about. The world continued as if oblivious to the fact that a titan was fading. Harold's sunken eyes traced the familiar skyline, yet he found no comfort in it. The towering buildings, once his domain, now felt distant, foreign, as though he were already slipping into a place where wealth and power held no weight. He turned his head slightly, every movement a painful reminder of time's cruelty. His vision blurred as he looked toward the small wooden nightstand beside him. There, resting beneath the glow of a dim hospital lamp, lay an old, weathered collar. Its leather, cracked with age, bore the name Max's German Shepherd, his only true companion. Harold's frail fingers twitched, yearning to hold it, but his strength failed him. The nurse, a woman with kind eyes and an air of gentle patience, noticed the movement. "Would you like me to bring it closer, Mr. Langston?" she asked softly. He gave the barest nod. As she placed the collar in his trembling grasp, memories surged through his fragile mind, memories of a time when his life had been filled with something other than ruthless ambition. Max had come into his life when he was just a boy, a gift from a father who never had time for him. The dog had been his solace, his shadow, the one soul who never cared about Harold's wealth or status. Through every triumph, every failure, Max had remained. And now, as Harold's body withered away, there was only one final request on his lips. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Bring him to me." The nurse hesitated. "Mr. Langston, are you sure he hasn't been here in—" Harold's watery eyes met hers, filled with a silent plea. She swallowed, nodding. "I'll see what I can do." As she left the room, Harold's fingers tightened around the collar. His breath trembled. The walls seemed to close in around him. He wasn't afraid of death. He was afraid of facing it alone. Outside the hospital, the autumn wind howled against the glass, rattling the window panes. Harold's mind drifted, past and present blurring into a haze of regret and longing. He had spent a lifetime accumulating wealth, yet he had never truly understood the value of time. People had come and gone, wives, business partners, supposed friends, but Max had always remained. Even when Harold had pushed everyone else away, drowning himself in endless work, Max had waited by the door each night, eyes full of unwavering devotion. The door creaked open, jolting Harold from his thoughts. A man stepped inside, a younger figure, dressed in an expensive suit. His face was familiar, though hardened by years of estrangement. "Ethan," Harold rasped, his throat dry. His son stood at the foot of the bed, hands in his pockets. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of anger and uncertainty. "I got a call," Ethan said, his voice tight. "They said you didn't have much time." Harold swallowed, suddenly unsure of what to say. There was a time when he had seen so much of himself in Ethan, the same sharp ambition, the same hunger for success. But somewhere along the way, Harold had failed him. He had prioritized the empire over the boy who had once looked at him with admiration. "I didn't think you'd come," Harold admitted, his fingers still clutching Max's collar. Ethan exhaled sharply. "Neither did I." A silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Ethan's eyes flickered to the collar in Harold's hands. "You still have that thing?" he asked, almost scoffing. Harold managed a weak chuckle. "The one thing I never let go of." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You let go of everything else." The words cut deep, but Harold didn't flinch. He deserved them. Before he could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. The nurse stepped in, her expression unreadable. "He's here." Harold's heart stuttered. For the first time in years, something inside him stirred, something beyond regret and loneliness, hope. The nurse stepped aside, and in walked Max. The German shepherd was older now, his muzzle dusted with gray, but his eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, remained the same. Harold's breath hitched as Max approached, ears twitching, tail uncertain. Then, as if recognizing the man before him, the dog let out a soft whimper and closed the distance. As Max pressed his head against Harold's frail hand, something inside the old man cracked. A choked sob escaped his lips. For the first time in decades, Harold Langston felt truly, undeniably seen. Max's warm breath fanned against Harold's frail fingers as the dog nuzzled closer. The old man's chest rose and fell unevenly, a strangled mix of relief and sorrow pressing against his ribs. Ethan stood by the bedside, arms still crossed, watching the scene with a conflicted expression. For a long time, Harold had believed that money could fill the void left by broken relationships. He had convinced himself that success justified his absence, that providing for his family was more important than being present. But now, as Max gazed at him with the same unwavering loyalty that had defined their bond for years, Harold realized the bitter truth: he had abandoned the only things that truly mattered. Max let out a small whimper, his tail wagging cautiously. His eyes scanned Harold's face as if searching for the man he had once known. The nurse shifted slightly, clearing her throat. "He was a little hesitant at first," she said gently. "It's been years since he's seen you." Harold swallowed, his throat dry. Years. He had left Max in the care of his estate manager when his health had started to decline, believing it was the right thing to do, believing Max would be better off without him. And yet, despite the years apart, the dog had come. "I should have come sooner," Harold murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Ethan scoffed. "You had years, Dad." Harold flinched at the sharpness of his son's words. He wanted to explain, to make Ethan understand, but what excuse could possibly make up for a lifetime of absence? Max's ears twitched at the tension in the room. He turned his head toward Ethan, his eyes flicking between father and son. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Ethan exhaled sharply and walked toward the window, his hands shoved into his pockets. The nurse glanced between them before offering a small nod. "I'll give you both some time." She turned to Max and gave him a reassuring pat before stepping out of the room. Harold's chest ached not from illness, but from the unbearable weight of unfinished conversations. He looked at his son, who stood stiffly by the window, gazing out at the city below. "I didn't call you here for forgiveness," Harold finally said, his voice hoarse. Ethan didn't turn around. "Good, because I don't have any to give." The words stung, but Harold accepted them without protest. He had been a man who measured his life in numbers and profits, in mergers, in the value of his stocks. But standing at the precipice of death, he realized that the only numbers that mattered were the years he had lost, the moments he had missed. "I thought if I gave you everything, you wouldn't need me," Harold admitted, his fingers still buried in Max's fur. "But I was wrong." Ethan let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Yeah, you were." A heavy silence followed, broken only by the distant hum of the city outside. Max, ever perceptive, nudged Harold's hand before turning his head toward Ethan, letting out a quiet whine. Ethan's shoulders stiffened. Harold sighed. "He still remembers you, you know." Ethan finally turned, his eyes flicking to the dog. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, nostalgia, maybe even guilt. As a boy, Ethan had spent hours with Max, running through the sprawling gardens of their estate, playing fetch, until the sun dipped below the horizon. But when Harold had pulled away from his son, Ethan had pulled away from everything that reminded him of his father, including Max. Ethan took a step closer, hesitant. Max tilted his head before trotting over, his tail wagging slightly. "You still remember me, huh?" Ethan muttered, kneeling down. Max licked his hand. Something cracked in Ethan's expression. He let out a shaky breath, his fingers curling into the dog's fur. Harold watched, a lump forming in his throat. He had always believed that money could fix things, that success would prove his worth. But now, in this small hospital room, with his son and his dog beside him, he understood money could never rebuild a bridge that had already burned. But maybe, just maybe, there was still time to lay down the first brick. The rain had started outside, soft droplets tapping against the window pane. The storm had been building all day, thick clouds rolling over the city, mirroring the turmoil within the hospital room. Ethan remained crouched beside Max, his fingers tracing absent patterns into the dog's fur, his mind clearly elsewhere. "You never said why you called me here," Ethan finally murmured, his voice softer than before. Harold inhaled deeply, his chest rattling with the effort. "I wanted to see Max one last time," he admitted. "And I wanted you to know—" He hesitated. "I wanted you to know that I never stopped thinking about you." Ethan let out a quiet breath, running a hand through his hair. "That's not enough, Dad." "I know." Max, sensing the tension, pressed himself closer between the two of them. The room fell into silence once more, but this time it felt different, less suffocating. Harold stared at his son, drinking in every detail the sharp angles of his jaw, the exhaustion lining his face, the tension in his shoulders that mirrored his own when he had been younger. He had spent years building a legacy, but he had never built a relationship with the one person who should have mattered most. "I never told you why I named him Max," Harold said after a moment. Ethan glanced at him, brow furrowed. "What?" Harold smiled faintly, the memory flickering in his mind like an old film reel. "When I was a boy, before the money, before all of it, I had a dog named Max. He was my best friend." Ethan didn't respond, but Harold saw the way his fingers twitched against Max's fur, absorbing the weight of his words. "My father never understood why I cared so much about a dog," Harold continued. "He thought love was a weakness, that attachments were distractions." He let out a slow breath. "I told myself I'd never be like him." Ethan's expression shifted, something unreadable flashing in his eyes. "And yet here we are." Harold's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes." The admission lingered between them. No excuses, no defenses, just truth. Ethan sighed, shaking his head. "Why now?" Harold swallowed. "Because I don't want to die with nothing but regrets." His gaze flicked toward Max, the dog still watching them both intently. "I thought maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to fix at least one thing before I go." Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. He looked exhausted, emotionally drained. "And what exactly do you expect me to do with that?" Harold's grip on Max's collar tightened. "Whatever you want." Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. "That's not how this works, Dad." "I know." The room fell silent again, save for the soft ticking of the wall clock. Then, after a long pause, Ethan sighed. "Max stays with me after you're gone." Harold blinked, surprised. He had assumed Max would return to the estate, another piece of history left behind. But Ethan's words carried a different weight tone Harold hadn't dared hope for. Ethan glanced at him. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I won't let Max go through this alone." Harold exhaled slowly, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. "That's more than I deserve." For the first time in decades, Harold felt something shift. A bridge, still broken but no longer impassable. Max let out a quiet sigh, curling up between them. The storm outside continued, but in the hospital room, the air felt just a little bit lighter. The storm outside grew heavier, the rain slamming against the hospital window like impatient fingers tapping at glass. The low hum of medical equipment filled the room, steady and rhythmic, a stark contrast to the uneven, rattling breaths that left Harold's lips. His skin had grown paler, the deep lines on his face looking more like cracks in fragile porcelain. Time was slipping through his fingers like grains of sand, and he knew it. Max remained curled at his side, his deep brown eyes scanning Harold's face with quiet understanding. The old German shepherd had always sensed things before they happened, an intuitive presence that had never wavered. Harold ran a trembling hand through the dog's thick fur, savoring the warmth beneath his fingers. Ethan stood a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest. His expression was unreadable. Perhaps it was anger, perhaps it was sorrow, perhaps it was both. "You never said why you really called me," Ethan finally spoke, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. "You said it wasn't for forgiveness, so what was it for?" Harold exhaled slowly. "To try." Ethan frowned. "Try what?" Harold looked at him then, really looked at him, his son, a man he barely knew anymore, the boy he had left behind in pursuit of ambition, the child who had once idolized him and later resented him. Now, standing before him was neither of those things, just a man searching for answers Harold wasn't sure he could give. "To try and give you something real before I go," Harold admitted, his voice weak. "Something that isn't money or apologies that came too late." Ethan let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. You really think words on your deathbed are going to make up for decades of silence? No, Harold said simply. Then why? Ethan demanded. Why now? You had years, Dad. Years to pick up the phone, years to try. But you didn't. You didn't care then. So why should I believe you care now? Harold's grip on Max's fur tightened. He didn't flinch at Ethan's anger. He had expected it, had deserved it. But that didn't mean the words didn't cut deep. I did care, Harold murmured, his voice trembling, but I was afraid. Ethan scoffed. Afraid of what? Me? Harold swallowed hard. Afraid of failing again. Afraid of reaching out and realizing I'd already lost you. Ethan's jaw clenched. You lost me the day you chose your company over your family. Harold closed his eyes for a moment, his breath shallow. I know. Silence settled between them, thick and heavy. The storm outside raged on, wind howling against the building as if it were mourning something unseen. Max let out a small whimper, shifting his weight. He nudged Harold's hand with his nose, pressing himself closer as if he could sense how fragile the moment was. Ethan sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. I don't know what you want from me, he admitted. I don't know how to do this. Harold looked at him, a sad smile pulling at his lips. Neither do I. And for the first time in years, they sat in the same room not as father and son, not as two people divided by resentment, but simply as two men who had no idea how to bridge the gap between them. The rain continued its relentless assault against the hospital window, drowning the world outside in a blurry haze. Inside, the air was thick with unsaid words, as if the room itself carried the weight of a lifetime of missed chances. Ethan leaned against the window, his gaze distant. You know, he muttered, I spent years telling myself I didn't care, that you were just a name, a man I used to know. Harold's breath hitched slightly, but he said nothing. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. But when they called me, when they said you were dying, he trailed off, shaking his head. I realized I wasn't ready for this. Harold watched him with tired eyes. Neither was I. Ethan scoffed. Well, that makes two of us. Silence fell between them again. But this time it felt different. Not as suffocating. Not as final. Harold turned his gaze back to Max, his fingers still buried in the dog's thick fur. You know, I named him after the dog I had when I was a kid, he murmured. Ethan's brow furrowed. What? Harold smiled faintly. Max, that was my first dog's name. He was the only thing that ever felt constant when I was young. Ethan's arms loosened across his chest. I never knew that. Harold exhaled slowly. Because I never told you. Ethan hesitated, then asked, Why? Harold let out a soft chuckle, though there was no humor in it. Because my father never saw the value in talking about things like that. And I guess I followed in his footsteps more than I ever wanted to. Ethan's gaze softened. I thought love was something you provided, Harold continued. Something you bought, something you proved by making sure your family never had to struggle. He swallowed. But I never realized that sometimes love is just being there. Ethan didn't respond right away. He simply studied his father, as if seeing him in a new light. The man who had always seemed so untouchable, so cold, now looked impossibly small in that hospital bed. I don't know how to forgive you, Ethan admitted finally. Harold gave a weak smile. Then don't. Ethan frowned. Harold's eyes softened. Forgiveness isn't something I deserve, Ethan. But if there's one thing I hope, it's that you don't let my mistakes define you. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tightening. I don't want you to end up like me, Harold murmured. I don't want you to wake up one day and realize you spent your whole life chasing something that never mattered. His gaze flickered toward Max. Because in the end, when everything fades, the only thing that remains is who you love, and who you let love you back. Ethan's breath hitched. He hadn't expected this honesty, this rawness. He had spent years imagining what his father's final words would be, and yet none of them had prepared him for this. For the first time, Harold wasn't trying to justify himself. He wasn't trying to fix things with money or power. He was simply admitting the truth. Max let out a soft whimper, shifting closer. Ethan sighed. Max stays with me after you're gone. Harold's lips parted slightly in surprise. Ethan glanced at him. I don't know if I can forgive you, but I won't let Max go through this alone. Harold exhaled, something like relief flickering in his eyes. That's more than I deserve. The storm outside showed no signs of stopping. But inside the hospital room, for the first time in a long, long time, the air felt lighter. Not whole, not healed, but something close. Something like hope. The hospital room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in, suffocating, pressing against Harold's frail body with an invisible weight. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors had become an ever-present reminder that time was slipping away, ticking toward an inevitable end. The storm outside raged on, thunder rumbling through the sky like an unseen force shaking the heavens. The rain smacked against the window, blurring the city lights into a distorted mess of colors, cold, distant, indifferent. Harold lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts unraveling into a tangle of memories and regrets. His body was failing, and he could feel it now more than ever, the slow fading of strength, the creeping chill in his fingertips, the exhaustion that burrowed deep into his bones. He was a man who had spent his entire life chasing something just out of reach, only to arrive at the end and realize he had been running in the wrong direction all along. Max let out a soft whimper beside him, shifting his weight as he pressed his warm body against Harold's side. The German shepherd had barely moved since arriving, his eyes never leaving his owner's face, as if he knew the inevitable was coming. Harold reached a trembling hand toward the dog's fur, his fingers barely managing to curl around the thick coat. "You always stayed," he whispered. His voice cracked, thin, fragile, no matter what. Max's ears twitched, and he let out a deep sigh, pressing his head gently against Harold's arm. A sharp pain shot through Harold's chest, forcing him to close his eyes for a moment. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, forcing his mind to stay present. He wasn't afraid of death. No, what terrified him was the thought of dying alone, the realization that he had built an empire but had no one to share it with, that he had spent years accumulating wealth, yet here he was, with nothing but a dog and a son who wasn't sure if he could even forgive him. The irony of it all made his lips twitch into something that might have been a bitter smile. He turned his head slightly, eyes landing on Ethan, who sat in the chair near the window. His son was staring at the storm outside, arms folded across his chest, lost in his own thoughts. Harold watched him for a long moment. The weight of time settled heavily in his chest. Many years had passed between them. How many birthdays had he missed? How many times had Ethan wished for a father who would simply show up? "I should have been better," Harold rasped, his voice barely more than a breath. Ethan turned slightly, his face unreadable. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You should have." Harold nodded weakly. "I don't have an excuse." Ethan let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "I don't need an excuse, Dad. I just needed you to care before it was too late." Harold swallowed, his throat dry. "And now?" Ethan hesitated. He looked at his father, the once powerful man now reduced to a frail, dying figure. He looked at Max, curled beside him, never once leaving. And then he looked at the storm outside, the rain relentless, unyielding, as if washing away the years of distance between them. Finally he sighed. "Now, I don't know what I need." Harold closed his eyes. He had spent years living with regrets, but this was the heaviest one of all. He had been given time, and he had wasted it. He had been given love, and he had neglected it. And now, he had been given a final chance, but he wasn't sure if he had the strength to hold on to it. The pain in his chest worsened, a deep, aching pressure that told him his body was beginning to fail. His breath came slower now, each inhale a little weaker than the last. Max lifted his head, ears twitching, sensing the change. Harold's fingers curled slightly in the dog's fur, his vision blurred, not from tears, but from something else. Something heavier. A lifetime of moments flashed through his mind, his father's stern voice, telling him that love was for the weak, his younger self, vowing to prove that success was the only thing that mattered, his first $1 million, the feeling of triumph, the hunger for more. And then Ethan, a boy who had once clung to his leg, begging him to stay home, just for one night, a boy who had waited by the door for a father who never came, a boy who had learned, too young, that love was not something he could count on. "I was wrong," Harold whispered. His lips barely moved, his breath was barely there. "About everything." Ethan turned fully now, something flickering in his eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close to understanding. Harold inhaled one last shaky breath. He felt the warmth of Max's fur. He saw the shadow of his son. And for the first time in his life, he let go. The storm outside roared, and then silence. The moment Harold's breath left his body, the hospital room seemed to freeze. The storm outside raged on, wind howling against the glass, rain pelting against the windows in relentless waves. But inside, everything was still. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor until, suddenly, it changed. A long, unbroken tone filled the air, a sound that carried the finality of death. Ethan stood motionless, his breath caught somewhere between his chest and his throat. He had spent years telling himself that this moment wouldn't matter, that when his father was gone, he wouldn't feel anything. No grief, no regret, just emptiness. But as he stared at Harold's still body, as he watched the life fade from his pale features, something inside him cracked. Max let out a quiet, heart-wrenching whimper, pressing his nose against Harold's arm. When the old man didn't stir, the dog nudged him again, more urgently this time, his tail lowering. A deep, mournful whine escaped Max's throat, as if he understood, as if he knew. The nurse rushed into the room, her face immediately falling as she took in the scene. "Time of death," she murmured, glancing at the clock on the wall before recording it in her notes. Ethan didn't move. He couldn't. Harold Langston was gone. And despite everything, despite the years of distance, the resentment, the silence, Ethan felt the crushing weight of it. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply stared at the man who had been a ghost in his life long before death had come for him. A lifetime of questions flooded his mind. Why didn't you try sooner? Why did you wait until the end to say what I needed to hear? Would things have been different if you had just stayed? But there were no answers, only silence. Max let out another quiet whimper, his ears lowering. The dog laid his head against Harold's still chest, as if refusing to let him go. Ethan's throat tightened. He had told his father that he couldn't forgive him, that it was too late. But now, standing in the wreckage of their unfinished story, he wasn't so sure. The funeral was small. Harold Langston had built an empire, but in the end, very few had come to say goodbye. The service was held in a quiet, secluded cemetery just outside the city. The air was crisp, the scent of damp earth lingering in the aftermath of the storm. The sky remained overcast, as if the world itself had dulled in the wake of Harold's passing. Ethan stood at the edge of the grave, hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. He hadn't spoken during the service. He hadn't even been able to look at the polished wooden casket as it was lowered into the ground. Max sat beside him, his gaze locked on the grave, unmoving. He hadn't eaten much since Harold had passed. He barely left Ethan's side, but there was an unmistakable sadness in his eyes. He was a difficult man, a voice said from behind. Ethan turned to see the nurse who had cared for Harold in his final days. She offered a small, knowing smile. But I think, in the end, he tried. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he muttered, "just not soon enough." The nurse studied him for a moment. "Regret is a heavy thing to carry," she said softly. "But so is resentment, and I think whether you believe it or not, didn't want you to carry either." Ethan's fingers curled inside his pockets. She gave him a small nod before stepping away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Max let out a quiet sigh beside him, resting his head against Ethan's leg. Ethan looked down at the dog, his heart twisting. "Guess it's just us now, huh?" Max didn't move, didn't make a sound, but his presence was an answer in itself. Ethan turned back to the grave, staring at the name engraved into the stone. Harold Langston. The man who had built a kingdom. The man who had died trying to reclaim something he had lost. Ethan swallowed hard, then whispered, "Goodbye, Dad." Max let out a quiet whine, and for the first time, Ethan reached down and ran his fingers through the dog's fur. They stood there, side by side, as the wind carried away the last of the fallen leaves. The days after the funeral passed in a blur. Ethan returned to his apartment, but it didn't feel the same. He had spent most of his adult life believing that he was better off without his father, that he didn't need the man's approval, his apologies, or his presence. But now, with Harold truly gone, an emptiness had settled inside him. Max had taken to lying by the door, ears perking up at the sound of footsteps in the hall, as if expecting Harold to walk in at any moment. But when the door remained closed, the dog would sigh and curl back into himself, a quiet sadness lingering in his eyes. Ethan understood that feeling too well. One evening, As the city lights flickered outside his window, Ethan sat on his couch, staring at the old leather collar in his hands. Max Harold's only true companion in the years he had spent alone. Ethan exhaled and glanced down at the dog resting at his feet. "You miss him, don't you?" Max lifted his head, ears twitching. Ethan sighed, running a hand over his face. "Yeah, me too." For a long time he had carried anger like a shield, convincing himself that if he never let Harold back in, he could never be hurt again. But what he hadn't realized was that by shutting his father out, he had also shut out the possibility of healing. Harold had been wrong about a lot of things, but in the end, he had tried, and maybe that had to be enough. Ethan looked at Max, at the way the dog still watched him with quiet understanding. "I think he'd want me to take care of you," Ethan murmured. Max's tail thumped once against the floor. A small smile tugged at Ethan's lips. He reached down, running his fingers through Max's fur. The dog leaned into the touch, warm and steady. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something shift inside him, a weight lifting. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting the past. Maybe it was about choosing not to let it define the future. And as Max curled up beside him, Ethan finally allowed himself to believe just for a moment that healing was possible. Even after everything. Even after all the years lost. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start again. The days turned into weeks, and the sharp edge of loss dulled into something softer, something that no longer felt like a wound but more like a scarone that would never fade completely but would stop aching with every movement. Ethan had never been the type to dwell on emotions, but grief had a way of forcing itself into every quiet moment, demanding to be acknowledged. He had spent so many years resenting Harold, convincing himself that his father was nothing more than a figure in the past, a name without meaning. But now, as he stood at the threshold of his father's estate, we realized just how much space Harold had occupied in his life. The mansion was exactly as he remembered it from childhood. Grand, intimidating, filled with things that were meant to impress but had never felt like home. The tall iron gates had been rusted slightly by time, the sprawling gardens overgrown, as if the land itself had started to let go of Harold the moment he passed. Ethan exhaled and glanced down at Max, who sat patiently beside him. The German shepherd had stuck to his side in the weeks since Harold's death, as if silently waiting for Ethan to decide what came next. "Guess this place is ours now," Ethan muttered. Max's ears perked, but he didn't move. He was waiting, just like Ethan. Stepping forward, Ethan pushed the gates open and walked up the long driveway. He half expected the house to feel cold, lifeless, but when he stepped inside, something unexpected happened. Memories flooded him. Not the bad ones. Not the nights he had waited for Harold to come home and never did. Not the birthdays spent staring at an empty chair. But the good ones. His mother's laughter echoing through the halls. The way Harold had once carried him on his shoulders through these very rooms when he was too small to walk on his own. The way Max, as a puppy, had once skidded across these polished floors, too excited to stop himself from crashing into furniture. Ethan swallowed hard. Maybe the house wasn't as empty as he thought. Max let out a quiet huff, padding ahead of him as if he knew the way, as if he had been waiting to return. Ethan followed, moving through the halls slowly, taking in everything with fresh eyes. At the far end of the house, he found Harold's study. It was exactly as his father had left it. A large oak desk, shelves filled with books Ethan doubted Harold had ever read, a leather chair that still bore the faintest indentation of his father's form. But what caught Ethan's attention wasn't any of that. It was what sat on the desk. A small, neatly stacked pile of letters. Ethan frowned, stepping closer. The top envelope had his name on it. His fingers hovered over it for a moment before he picked it up, breaking the seal. The handwriting was rough, shaky. Harold's. "Ethan, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if you'll care. But I need to write it anyway. I was never good at saying things out loud, and that's my greatest failing. If I could go back, if I could do it all over again, I wouldn't choose money. I wouldn't choose work. I'd choose you. Every time. I spent my life trying to be a man my father would have been proud of, but in doing so, I became a man my son couldn't love, and for that, I am sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. But if there's one thing I hope for, it's that you don't become me. Don't waste your life chasing things that don't matter. Love what you have while you still have it. Max is yours now. He's always been part of this family just like you. And I hope that, in some way, he can give you the comfort I never could. I was proud of you, Ethan. Even when I didn't say it. Even when I didn't show it. I was proud of you. Dad. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He read the letter again, and then again. And then he sat down, letting out a slow, shaky breath, his fingers tightening around the paper. He had spent years believing his father never cared, that Harold had chosen his empire over his own family, that nothing he did had ever mattered to him. But here, in ink and trembling handwriting, was the truth. Harold had cared. Maybe not in the right way, maybe not in the way Ethan had needed him to, but he had. And for the first time, Ethan didn't feel anger when he thought of his father. Just sorrow and understanding. A quiet, bittersweet acceptance. Max nudged his knee, sensing the shift in the air. Ethan exhaled and reached down, running a hand through the dog's fur. "Come on," he murmured. "Let's go home." Max wagged his tail. And for the first time in a long, long time, Ethan knew where he was going. Life is fleeting, and in the end, it's not wealth or power that truly matters, it's the connections we make, the love we give, and the time we choose to spend with those who matter most. Harold learned this too late, but Ethan now has a chance to move forward, to heal, and to carry on the love his father never knew how to express. What about you? Are there words you've left unsaid, people you've pushed away, moments you wish you could reclaim? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.